Hey everyone, this is Ryan with From Corners Unknown. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to our Artist Conversation series, and in this episode I speak with Sharon of VANCORVID. VANCORVID is an ethereal tonic of experimental electronic and violin-based arrangements, enshrouded in chilling ambient auras and interlaced with these whispered dreamlike vocals. This project sprouted up in an unplanned manner after she moved from her homeland of Ireland to Toronto for a fresh start at a new career and to explore a myriad of artistic endeavors on this broadening horizon. Sometime after finding her footing on this new soil, she joined a couple of orchestras to maintain and sharpen her violin skills and simultaneously garner a deeper knowledge and understanding of orchestral arrangements. And through this growing knowledge, while important for VANCORVID's development and growth, it dually serves the purpose of refining her classical composition toolkit so one day she can arrange her own symphony. In the summer of 2017, VANCORVID released her first single, Breathe, and just in November of 2018, she released her latest single titled Summon, of which there is a remix by the Los Angeles-based electronic group Precious Child. These two tracks, while released relatively far apart from each other, are of an unreleased EP titled Hatch, and though the entirety of this EP is not recorded yet, it articulates VANCORVID's nonlinear process of healing, which is discussed in deeper detail in the conversation ahead. Additionally, she discusses the writing and recording process of her latest track, Summon. She also delves into her unique, evocative blend of tones and timbres. She talks about paying respects to the Irish goddess Morrigan, and she also describes one of her hobbies where she collects fairy tales from a vast array of cultures. So I sincerely hope you folks enjoy the conversation. Just after this introduction, I will play for you folks VANCORVID's track Summon, and at the conversation's conclusion, I will play her track titled Breathe. As always, thank you so much for your continued support, and thank you for any and all support you can give VANCORVID.
I batter against the ceiling of my knowledge like a frightened bird. Does madness lie in the brain, in the body, in the past? No. It lies in the why, in the lack of an answer to the why. A response comes from a call, from a summoning. Summon your strength, summon your answers, summon your courage, summon your guts and your bones and your vague beliefs that you barely hold to, and come to me. Summon your voice and speak. Not I, not I. It's not I you're fighting, but it's me who stands before you. Summon your fury to match to mine. Fury sparks a flame. I burn, I glow. How hot is your blood? Do not fear me, for I am your subtle retribution. Fury and fear are both sides of the coin. I feel the beating of heavy wings. Hundreds of black feathers flying, each feather a wish, a magic given freely, unconditional. Summon, summon, beating of black wings. Safe to return, light has passed. I feel the air from other planets. Ice a beacon, summon, summon. Swim in air, sleek and strong. And the first crow, the skeleton station.
I usually have a hard time figuring out a place to start these.
Well, every epic always starts in the middle of the action.
That is true. Well, I guess, yeah, because I wanted to go back and kind of explore the beginning of your musical career and see how you've morphed over time, but maybe starting, as you said, in just the middle of an epic. So you've been living in Toronto for how long now?
4 years.
And that was, I know you've spoken about this in a handful of interviews, but maybe for the audio format, this could be a bit different. So you were working in Ireland for a bit. I recall there were some notes about you were trying to do some stuff in the video game industry, and you have more of a tech background. Is that right? And you just moved over to Toronto to kind of just refresh or get a new start elsewhere? Or could you talk about that a little bit?
Okay, yeah. So yes, you're right. There was some tech background. Funny story. Original degree was actually in English and history, and
okay.
I graduated into a recession, and I couldn't make anything work for a year. So I ended up contacting all these talent agency or talent websites and stuff,
Right.
and went off touring for 3 months with this band around Europe. During which I learned a good bit about sound and live sound and things like that. And I didn't know a lot before then, so I came back and I went, I want to go pursue this more. So I took a master's in interactive digital media. The funny thing was I came out of it and I ended up at my master's showcase meeting my next boss, who asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I said roadkill. He offered me a job and I was like, I'm not sure if I should work for you if this is your judgment, but okay. And the irony was it was in finance. But to answer your question, I didn't actually answer it at all. Part of the reason I came to Toronto, well, there are a few. The first one and the most immediate one was I met someone in Ireland who was from Canada, and we stayed in a sort of long distance, I don't know if you call it relationship, because I feel like you have to actually see a person to call it that. But
Right.
After about 2 years, I decided that what I was trying to do in Ireland, the gaming, everything like that, working these jobs in startups outside of my day job, I was just so frustrated and tired. And I was like, you know what, I'm just going to take some time away and, fresh start, see what happens.
Right.
And Toronto is safe, it's got pretty low crime rate. It's got minimal financial investment risk compared to New York or London, which I was thinking about as well.
I see.
So yeah, that was part of it. So yeah, I came over and actually started working as a cook before I got my current job. So I was slinging breakfast and making hot sauce.
Oh, okay, interesting. And what's your current job?
So I'm a training specialist, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, I work in a software company, but I used to build the systems. Now I do a mix of a little bit of building, a little bit of training the client how to build it themselves, advice, consultation, that kind of thing.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Huh. And when you were over in Ireland, I was interested in some of the more video game stuff. Were you trying to do or were you working on, say, soundtrack composing? Like, what was the job? What were you trying to do at that gig?
So at that point, I wasn't even writing music.
Okay.
I was actually, I started out working an internship in one company where I was doing kind of all the bits that no one wants to do, essentially. So your leading strategy, your planning, and that kind of moved into some like dialogue and storyboarding. But like really, when you're in those environments, it's kind of a case of who wants to do what, really. And my coding background wasn't incredibly strong, or at least not strong enough to write games. So I was more kind of the logistics kind of person, which meant I was popular, as all logistics people are. But yeah, no, it was an interesting experience. I learned a lot. I also had a very quick introduction to how startups can both do very well and also, how precarious they can be. Because one startup worked out and they kind of grew and evolved and kind of moved on from that to their own projects, and the other one did not grow and evolve. And it's very interesting to see how that can influence how you operate, how you go about your plans and stuff like that.
Right.
So yeah, and that's been really useful for me as well in terms of, because for what I'm doing at the moment, it feels like I'm trying to, almost run a small business, and
I see.
and the people I'm trying to bring in, I have to be very conscious that they're solid.
I recall in one of the interviews, so VANCORVID, your project, so that the way you described it, it seems like it just cropped up. It wasn't something you necessarily planned to begin doing when you made the move over to Toronto. Is that correct? It just kind of sprouted up, or how did that project develop for you?
So basically, yeah, you're right. It wasn't. So when I moved over to Toronto, I kind of thought, okay, great, I'll have space to work on music and composition. But it wasn't anything like what's been coming out. So originally, when I came over to Toronto, I started taking composition lessons because I was planning to release a symphony. I still am, but
Right.
that'll be many years down the future. And it was just funny because I was plugging away at that, and I wasn't really getting anywhere, and things kind of outside of that got a bit worse because some immigration issues that were my fault because I didn't do enough research.
I
But
see.
yeah,
I read a bit about that too, and I didn't know if you want that. That sounds like that may not be a great experience to dredge up, but I did see that tendril or that tidbit of information in a couple different interviews, and I don't know, it seemed like that would be a very worrying or very unnerving experience.
it was a bit scary. I mean, I'm fine to talk about it now because it's in retrospect it's kind of funny.
Oh, I see.
In not necessarily a ha ha, but
Right.
oh my god kind of way.
Right.
But yeah, so basically, just long story short, I went through the residency program and I thought I had everything good to go. And I thought all you needed was proof that you'd submitted. And even if your visa ran out, you were still covered.
I see.
That was the case, which I didn't realize until the Thursday before my visa expired, which was a long weekend. My HR manager called me in and said, "Hey, so any updates?" And I was like, "No, I've told you everything." She's like, "Yeah, well, just so you know, your visa runs out on Tuesday." And I kind of, the bottom dropped out of my stomach. And then, so basically, she was an absolute hero. She got me an immigration lawyer who, even though he was waiting for a flight to Munich that night, was calling me, giving me instructions. I was scribbling them down on the side of the road. Got in the necessary paperwork the morning of the expiry, and
Wow.
just after that, yeah, it was fine after that.
Yes.
But stress, you can imagine, I kind of had I had a bit of a meltdown, and
Yeah, I would. I don't know. It seems like it would be hard to maintain your composure in a situation like this, especially if you made a move so far and then that would just have gotten uprooted in a day, right? Or just within a moment. It seems.
yeah, kind of. I mean, it was just one of those moments of, oh my god, and in my head, I'm
Right.
already like laying out plans, like, okay, how much is shipping going to cost? How much is this? How much is this? And I was thinking, like, I could just see the numbers racking up, and I was like, oh gosh.
Sure.
And then, some other personal stuff happened around that time because that's how life goes. And I think a couple months later, I like to paint a lot, and I often paint to a particular piece of music. And
Okay.
yeah, so I'll just play it on loop and paint over and over and over. But so to me, sometimes people are a song. So if I know I'm doing a work for a specific person, I'll find the piece of music that sounds like them. I'll loop it and I'll paint.
Just out of my own curiosity, how do you usually sync up which piece of music links up with the individual in mind?
It can really be anything. So sometimes it's not even the person as they are all the time. It's the person as they are in that particular moment. It's more something, because to me it's almost like frequencies in a weird way.
Sure.
So multiple frequencies. So like the tonal frequency, rhythmic frequency, tempo, because everyone moves in a different way. Everyone they have a beat, they have a gait that's unique. Actually, that's how they treat people in NASA. Actually, fun fact, they get you to walk up and down multiple times, record your gait because that's unique to each person.
Is it? Huh. I have never even heard of that before. Wow. Huh. That's very interesting.
There's a saying that a man's leg is his second face. So yeah, always good to watch out for.
I've already learned so much. Yeah, I've already learned so much just within those few sentences. I've never heard of any of that before. That's pretty amazing. Huh.
Right. Yeah, so basically when I hear beats and stuff and I'm not playing them, I turn it into gestures. But so then sometimes I hear a piece of music and I'm like, that matches this person in this particular aspect.
Interesting.
It's not all the time. I can't immediately do it. It's just sometimes like if I know a person well enough, and I tend to only paint for people I know, so they're not good. They're just there. Anyway, I was listening to one track on loop, and I ended up painting this I Am VANCORVID thing. I think I went into where the name comes from as well, but it kind of went from something jokey to something much more serious, and
Sure.
yeah, it's worked out. And I still have that painting, but I don't know if it's ever going to go anywhere.
I see. And is that I don't know, I just find that the painting piece very interesting. And is that something you do only in that capacity with respect to, say, somebody's gait, somebody's beat? You only do it in that regard, or do you do painting just generally as well, or is that just kind of a passion or just a side hobby of a sort? I don't know if that's the right word to use, but
I mean, hobby's a good word for it. I like to paint, and it's sometimes I'll just paint for myself. Sometimes I just have ideas that I want to make happen. But then
Sure.
there's painting times, there's music times, there's writing times. So it just tends to be what I go for. But by the way, not sure if you know the reason for get a hobby was actually a hobby is a type of hawk.
no, I wasn't even aware of that either.
So fun fact, when someone says get a hobby, it's actually telling someone to get outside and have a hawk and go hawking, because it would mean they would stop being basically the 16th century equivalent of an internet troll.
Oh my gosh, really? Man,
Yeah.
I've not heard of any of these. I mean, where do you pick up this kind of this information? Is this just from speaking with folks, or is there like a good bit of internet research you do for?
When I research, I tend to research very widely,
Okay.
because usually I find that if you're only looking up the source that's relevant to what you're specifically looking at, you are excluding a vast amount of context.
Oh, sure.
And history background. So one of the schools of historiography is called the Annales school. The way to summarize it is, instead of looking at a king's military strategy using the sea, you would look at the sea versus his military strategy. Key example being Philip II and the Mediterranean. Essentially, it means you're never finished researching. But
Right. No, that's very interesting. Of all the details you've divulged, or some of the little snippets and pieces of fun facts you provided me, these are all new pieces of knowledge that I've just never heard of before. So in addition to the project you're working on, or VANCORVID, so is outside of your main job, more the tech stuff, you're also part of a symphony, or is that a way for you to continue playing violin and working and honing and crafting that skill for you, working with other individuals?
absolutely. So the other orchestras I'm a member of, the Summerhill, I'm co-leader, and basically it's an amateur orchestra. We don't pay for money. We just play concerts. We fundraise for charity, that kind of thing.
Sure.
I just like it because it's an opportunity to play more complex orchestral work, and it keeps my technique at a level that I don't have to go to lessons as much. But the other thing as well is that eventually I want to start arranging for orchestras, and there's no better way to make that happen than if you're already there and they know you and you're a part of it.
And are you planning to, is that a goal of yours to, like, how soon were you thinking to be able to begin composing or just putting an orchestra together?
Well, my estimation of my own timelines has proven to be wildly inaccurate. So I would have said, maybe if you'd asked me this last year, I'd have said, next year.
Right.
Given what I'm trying to do in the coming year, I'm going to say maybe at least 2 years from now.
Okay.
Not that I wouldn't want to. If I'm just estimating for my own time and skills, it won't be immediate. If I had someone to help me, yeah, way quicker.
Right. And what are I don't know how, well, I just don't know much about classical music and orchestral music. And that's what is interesting about this conversation for me, is that I think this is the first that I've done where this is wildly outside of what I'm typically used to discussing. So that may be feeding into why I sound so scatterbrained, or I'm just trying to figure out the right turns of phrase and vernacular, because I don't really know how to articulate my thoughts correctly. And please feel free to correct me as I ramble. But what kind of skills or experience do you need to continue to build to be able to piece together your own orchestra?
Good question. So basically, there's a few things. One of which is basic arrangement. So essentially, which parts of the orchestra should play which parts of your music.
Okay.
And that in itself has some degree of complexity, of course, because all instruments have different volume levels, color, tone, and you can do a lot with them if you know enough about the techniques. So I'm unfortunately a typical violinist in that I never really bothered to learn about the other instruments as much. I'm trying to learn more that way. And they all have different, they all work to different, they all transpose basically. So what you read as a violinist doesn't look the same to a clarinet player or a violist and so on. So there's that too. And then as well, there's also a degree of, working with people who are willing to work with you. Like there's no point in me putting together a score for musicians I don't know and don't have time or scope to do the work. So, there's a degree of practicality there too. So, but yeah, ultimately what I would love to do in the future is write grand enough scale pieces and be able to conduct it myself.
And would that fall under, this may be a ridiculous question, but would this have any sort of relationship to your project VANCORVID, or is this almost a different world of sorts relative to your project, your personal project, I guess?
That's a really good question though. No, I think I would actually want them both to be contained together in the same universe. Like I look at artists like Imogen Heap and Ben Folds and people like that, and they're willing to dip in and out of orchestras. But I want to take it even further than that again. And I don't know if you've seen Imogen Heap's Mimu gloves.
I don't think so. I know the name Imogen Heap, and I've probably listened to a song or two, but that is again one of those. What's their genre technically? Is it some sort of electronic, or am I just totally showing off how ignorant I am at the moment?
Electronic's the one, but so what she did a while ago, and I'm kind of obsessed, but she made these gloves called Mimu gloves, which allow you to control the music with your hands. So essentially it's a bunch of sensors on gloves that are with your hands, so you can by gestures control things like faders, panning, drums, instrumentation, and they are fantastic looking.
Wow.
Yeah, so I thought, imagine what that would sound like if I had one of those gloves on and played violin.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that like a piece of technology that is, or like a development that is widely available to folks, or is it kind of can you gain access to something like that pretty easily, or is it a pretty expensive piece of equipment?
So it's pretty expensive right now, and they seem to be making them kind of on an order basis, so they have to be made pretty individually, but they do have a residency. So what I'm looking to do, again, I'm pushing the timelines out a bit so I can actually show them a project that I have an idea for. But the idea is you can do a residency for, let's say, 1 or 3 months, and by the end of it, you have a performance that you record with them. So.
Oh, okay. And but that wouldn't guarantee that you actually, so you would be able to use the equipment to produce what you want to produce, but you won't necessarily be in possession of the equipment once it's over with. Is that right? Or do you get the piece of equipment at the end of it as well?
I think it's just you give back the gloves, but they are all open source. So, if you did know someone who was very technically minded, they are buildable. Like, it's not proprietary software or hardware or anything, but it's just, they're like really, really amazing. I'll send you a link after this as well so you can have a look.
Yeah, I've never heard. Yeah, see, I've never heard of that either. I had no idea that those sorts of pieces of tech existed. That sounds very intriguing.
Yeah, it was something I kind of got into with my master's because, interactive media, but there were some people working with the Connect and, tracking gestures and stuff like that and how you could use it with sound. So for me, that's always something I wanted to go into more. At the moment, struggling with Ableton is enough for me.
I can't even imagine. I've heard that's a pretty, that's just is that a DAW essentially?
Yeah, it's a beast of a DAW.
I've heard, I've been using Reaper on the side for doing even my podcast editing, and that's a pretty nice and cheap and affordable piece of software, but I've heard some folks say Ableton is gargantuan to figure out or really get good with it.
Absolutely. And the thing is, for me as well, I tend to learn more when I have to do something with it. Like, sometimes learning for the sake of learning isn't terribly effective with me. So the first track I released, Breathe, I was working with Adam Dev, and he was showing me some production stuff, but I wish I could have retained more of what he showed me,
Right.
because there was just so much to it. You know, there's a good bit of anyone with an engineering background is going to have a really good time with Ableton, because it corresponds so clearly to the physics of sound that it makes sense.
Yeah, I can't even imagine just the complexity of the engineering side of using a DAW, or just understanding how well it ports into being able to work with sound waves, or the science behind it. I never really think about the complexity of it. I just do the simple edits. I completely overlook everything else, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I even made a massive mistake. So Summon, I recorded all in my apartment, and I was recording my vocals through a solo interface.
Okay.
But while I was doing it, there was the air show happening outside. So at one point, I was recording and like a plane whooshed by, and I listened back and I was like, "Oh, I really like this." But what happened then was I sent it on to one of my friends who's also a sound engineer once I'd had a couple of masters back from Martin, and he went, "There's a really significant buzz in here." And this was like 2 or 3 days before I planned to release it, and I thought it was, perfect. And he was like, "Look, I've got a friend and I can bring you into studio and you can re-record the vocals." And in my head, I'm like, "No,
Really?
don't make me do the air show." But then called Martin back and I said, "Hey, is there any way we can fix the buzz?" And he was like, "Oh, I thought you meant it like that." "Yeah, sure. It's done." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're amazing." And also very charitable that you thought I meant that humongous mistake.
And did the bit of the air show, that background, did that eventually, so that ended up getting sliced out, or is that still existing somewhere in the background? When I caught that note when reading one of your interviews, and I was trying to figure out where it was while listening to some, and I was like, man, I can't even, I had a hard time piecing it together, but based on how you said it, I'm like, oh, I need to find this sound now, and I couldn't find it. So
it's in the start. It's at the spoken word part, while there's just a going on. So you kind of hear it kind of going. I think when I'm talking about madness.
Okay. See, you could have fooled me with that, because I thought it was just a nice bit of background ambience, or like just a little, like sort of a dark ambient swell you folded in there, and I would have never thought that was just an airplane flying by or flying overhead.
I don't know. I mean, I probably spoiled the mystery there. I could have strung you along with that, but I sometimes I like to record in my apartment, even if I know it probably gives sound engineers an absolute living hell. But I got the idea from, there's a musician called Kaki King, and I was watching she's one of my favorite artists, she's amazing, but she was giving this interview about one of the making of her albums called Dreaming of Revenge. And the person she was working with had been a sound engineer for years, but she couldn't understand why he would leave things like fans blowing in the background and stuff like that. And then she realized that he was creating aura. And I do think that sometimes when you do record things, not entirely in a sterile environment, it can come through. And also, to be perfectly honest, I don't feel always as comfortable in studio unless I've been there a while and I know everyone in there.
Right. I think I could somewhat understand that. And is that, do you think with respect to VANCORVID, is that going to mostly be a project that you'll likely be recording in, say, your apartment or wherever you reside? It'll be more just a personal in-house sort of thing. You do not really see yourself going to a studio unless you may want to do, say, a full length or an LP of something of the sort.
I think, yeah, probably for a lot of it as well, it's to do with funding as well. A lot of the time I don't have a huge amount of disposable funds for studio recording, so if I can get away with recording it in my apartment, then yeah, I probably will.
Right.
And because as well, sometimes I'll just improvise takes on top of each other and I'll just layer them and cut them up while I'm in there, which I can't always do when I'm in a studio. And also, I don't know, I started studio recording pretty early on. First one I ever did was for a movie background. someone had I was still in school, and like secondary school, and they had taped the microphone cable to the ceiling so that it hung down in front of me, and I got paid in ice cream.
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, but at the same time, it's just kind of, I would rather be comfortable than sterile, I guess.
Right. No, that makes sense. I was also curious on the some of the it popped up in my head, but I didn't bring it up on the interactive media. I was just curious in how some of that ports into or somehow affects the way you compose or work on your music. Is there any sort of crossbreed or overlap between those, the work or your expertise in that area and the compositions you produce?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So basically, I think one of the main things that my masters did teach me was how to, one, watch every YouTube video in existence, and two, every discipline is connected. So even if I felt like I wasn't working on the right thing, I kind of am, because I'm kind of letting it cook with something else. So,
Sure.
like the Buddhist spiderweb concept.
I think so. Maybe you can explain it just to make sure I'm in full understanding.
So, essentially, there's two Buddhist spiderwebs. One is the spiderweb out of hell, but that's not the one I'm thinking of. It's actually if you imagine all knowledge as a giant spiderweb with a droplet of dew at each connecting point, each drop is reflected in all other droplets.
Huh.
So that's kind of how I see a lot of the work I make, because even if it's not directly contributing to the work, it's reflected in it.
I see.
And there's like a lot of what I write is very much distilled from what I've experienced. So it takes a long time to actually write a piece. Like Summon got written over like months. Like I wrote the Irish lyrics on a plane. I wrote another part of it months before that, and just kind of, it's like being surrounded by jigsaw puzzles, like with half of them out, and suddenly you're just like, oh, that goes there.
Sure.
You know.
How do you know? So when you wrote Summon, how do you know? And this may be an inane question, but how do you know, like when you have a kernel of an idea that other kernels that maybe sprout up, say several months later, several weeks later, how do you know that they can all congeal into one specific composition, as opposed to maybe saying each kernel can become its own idea or its own composition in its own right, if that makes sense?
I think partly because I just feel it, really.
Okay.
It sounds stupid, but I suppose because for me it's usually because they're the same color or subject. I do make the mistake often of putting too much into one piece, which could theoretically be spread out over several, but for now, I'm fine with that. At the same time, I suppose it's because I tend to keep a lot of projects in my head, and sort of, it's kind of like when you're on the lookout for something, and something just kind of pops up and you're like, oh, there it goes.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that how you see yourself producing, say, future compositions? I wanted to get a little more specific and see if there were plans to create more of a fully etched EP or an LP at some point, but based on, or some of the description of how it can take you a decent amount of time to put one composition together, I was interested to see if VANCORVID at this juncture, if it would be more of the compositions that you produce would be more just singles, as the ideas just sort of congeal naturally and in their own time and space, if that makes sense.
I got you. So yes, there is an EP plan in the works.
Okay.
Short up. The longer answer to that is, so I have, what I had originally were 5 tracks planned for it. And after having had the year I've had and everything that's come forward, there's been a couple more tracks that have kind of popped their heads up and said, actually, put me in there too. So it might end up being a bigger project, but the original plan for the EP was to be called Hatch.
Okay.
So I do have some plans for it. A couple of them will, I want it to be a very visual piece as well. So it's going to have a couple of videos. I wanted originally 5, but I'll see how much opportunity I can get for that.
Right.
Because a majority of what I do is kind of dependent on other people's goodwill, time, all that fun stuff.
Right.
Hatch would be about recovery as such. So 2 of the tracks that I've already released would be on it. So Breathe and Summon. And one thing you might notice about the 2 of them is that they're verbs. So it's kind of, the idea is sort of, a rebirth moment. So there's more planned, and now that I've had a chance to workshop a lot of stuff in front of people, I know that with some of them, some of the pieces may be more challenging to write or may take a different direction than originally thought.
Yeah, it just sounds interesting to me because I'm trying to put the thought or the question together in my head, because based on how long or just the amount of time it takes to say put one composition together. And Breathe, could you remind me when Breathe came? Was that was sometime last year, correct?
Yeah, I tried to release it the day I landed in Canada 3 years later, but I managed it about 5 to midnight, and that was as good as I got.
I see. Yeah, no, it just seems interesting to, I don't know, like, I could just imagine, and it could make, I mean, it probably will make for a very interesting EP once it all comes together. Just the thought, though, that it takes as long as it does to, say, pull a piece together, and then just given all the time and life experience you have between each composition, I would just think that it would make for pretty interesting wrinkles in sound, or just see how different each track sounds, almost like they're compartmentalizing different points in your life, as opposed to saying going in with 5 tracks or 6 tracks and recording them all at the same time, where you write them all within the span of several weeks. But how you're doing it now, it sounds like that can make for a pretty interesting listen, just because I would just be interested to see how the sound evolves between the songs, in a sense. I don't know if that actually makes sense. In my head it's making sense, but the way I'm speaking it now, I don't know if that actually is coming across that way. But
no, it totally makes sense, and I totally agree, because the first track I released, Breathe, very different to Summon.
Yeah, definitely.
And the irony, well, maybe not irony, is that those aren't even the first tracks. They're going to be middle tracks.
Oh, really? Huh.
Yeah, but okay, and here's where it sounds like an easy answer, but it is something I think. It's that recovery is not linear.
Right.
So, and I feel like if it was to just be an EP that went from like one evolve like a Pokemon,
yes,
it would feel less organic to me, because I don't think humans act that way. Like, we grow older, that's fair, but
sure,
how we choose to grow older and what we choose to do with our lives, that can take a lot of detours.
Right. Oh, and that's very interesting. Sorry, as you were saying, I'm just trying to formulate questions as you're divulging so many more details than what I could glean from, say, interviews and such. Like, I'm just trying to think through a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, so I tend to go off on tangents, so I appreciate you kind of accommodating that.
Oh, yeah. No, I usually, when I listen back to some of my conversations, I sometimes just ask myself, like, what the hell was I thinking when I asked that question, or where was my mind at that moment, just because I'm just trying to process so much information while trying to make sure it's coherent. It usually doesn't. It usually comes out okay. But
yeah.
I was going to ask about the healing process, or what have you. Please correct me on my use of words here. But could you speak a bit to what that process has been like, or what is there some specificity you could relate that to, so long as it doesn't get too personal or anything of the sort? Like, what does this relate to some of the reasons for your move from, say, Ireland to Toronto and things of the sort, or are there other personal undercurrents that are bubbling beneath that as well?
Wow, okay. So there's a lot to that question.
Okay. Yeah, sorry for... I'm not trying to make the questions loaded or anything. It's just with the information you provided me, it's just I'm very intrigued by this. So...
No, of course, I'm happy to answer, because, the first thing I suppose it's worth pointing out is for me, healing is just another part of the fight. And that's kind of the forefront of whatever I do. So for me, healing is a very active thing. It's an active agency. Like, you can't passively heal, you know, even if you're in a coma and healing, your body is still fighting for its life.
Sure.
So with that in mind, that's what Summon is about. It's fighting for your own recovery, for your own healing. It's calling down something bigger than you to help you. Because when you're in that space, when you're in that awfulness, and I mean, what I'm talking about refers more to depression, and I'm not speaking as a professional, so very much pointing that out beforehand. But for me, I think sometimes when you're in that place and it feels like a very empty or alone place, you have choices. You can stay there. You can call something in there that helps you. And you can also call something in that's much darker and worse in a sort of F the world nihilism sort of way.
Right.
And I feel like there are people, I've seen them, and they were in that place very obviously, but what they called in to help them out ultimately caused more destruction to people around them.
I see.
It's like when you play a video game, you can play it in two ways. One where you can go on like a full worst kill mission
Yes.
and just chore, or you can go in and try and help people.
Right.
And so for me, my version of trying to help people was to, not to sound twee, but kind of vocalize things that people feel that they don't want to feel, or they feel they can't or shouldn't or can't talk about.
Mhm.
Point out that it doesn't have to be that way.
Sure.
And so that's what recovery for me, just going through phases of a kind of depression, anxiety, low level stress, all that stuff, and what you can do while you're there without, the hashtag please talk, or, the ever frequent little flurries of people saying, oh, you can talk to me, when in reality, no, you can't, and no, they won't.
Right. Or they may not be willing. They may say, I'm here to listen, but it may not be a genuine remark in a sense. Is that fair to say?
I think people are well intentioned with that.
Mm-hmm.
Partly because they've probably never had to deal with it in any kind of extreme.
Sure.
Talking someone down off whatever it's an amazing thing to do for someone, but it's exhausting, and it's very difficult. And I think there needs to be more help around that, and more times when people need to be able to say, look, I can't help you. I can't listen in the way that you need, but I can do my best to help you get help. I can, bring you to a therapist. I can give you a bunch of numbers to call.
Sure.
Anyway, that's not tricky a subject that it's to navigate, but, I do think that people look to music and art as ways to deal with a lot of things. And again, it's whether you choose to deal with things in something that expresses a positive, or it's either something to show you what you have or to show you what you don't have.
Right.
So if there's a lot of music that focuses on what you don't have, that's probably not going to make you happy.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective too. I haven't even thought of that before either. But I was also curious, say on the other songs on your EP or not, I don't know if they've been recorded yet, but they're in the works, it sounds like. But were those compositions for the EP, are those fully formed yet, or are you still in this process of healing, or some of these tracks artifacts, or are they crystallizations of certain moments or certain pieces of healing that happened, say, several months or several years ago?
So they're a mix, absolutely. The lyrics are written for all five, and some of them they're very much a crystallized point in time. The first one for the EP, I'm actually planning to record early next year.
Okay, great.
It's called Abyss, and that one is very much something that I have felt and returned to more than once. But then there's other ones which captured something that I felt once or twice, and it's a place I want to get to, but I don't think I'm quite there yet myself. So there's a little bit of future proofing in there as well.
Okay. And is this, when you say place to trying to get to a certain place, is that from a musical standpoint, or is that you as, I guess that those would go hand in hand, but you as a person, or the strength or the healing process and how you end up coming out the other side of it, if that makes sense? I feel like I have these thoughts, but the way I'm saying them, sometimes it sounds correct in my head, but when I say it, it sounds a little ridiculous, but you can correct me on that.
No, it makes total sense. And I know that there's a point in time I need to reach, or a point in skill even, with to my orchestration and what I want in there. So at the moment, I kind of have this wireframe of what I want. And sometimes Stephen King said something about this. He said the story isn't something that you control, it controls you. So sometimes the story comes out as a really small, tiny little shell, and sometimes it's this giant skeletal fossil that you unearth, and you really don't know which way it's going to go. So I have this idea, and I've started working through it, and I hope it will become something interesting, at least. If it only turns out to be a little shell, then that's still something.
Sure. And do you not, and at this juncture, at least with respect to the compositions you've written, it's at this moment you don't really know if it is, say, a little shell or something larger. Would you be able to figure out or make that deduction or figure that out once the recording process is complete, and how you feel once it's out in the ether?
I actually don't even know if it would be up to me to define that, because it's
Okay.
really how it impacts other people.
Okay.
I mean, someone could come out of it and say, oh, that's something that really spoke to me or something like that. And then some people would come back and say just, oh, that's cool.
Right.
So I don't know. I'm going to be making this anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I did get a recent small criticism about how singles are not the most effective vehicle to release the kind of music I'm releasing, which I thought was quite funny, actually. Because I was kind of like, well, they described it as avant-garde, and I said, well, singles are not the proper vehicle. And I'm kind of like, well, the idea of having a proper vehicle for an avant-garde form is a bit of a misnomer, don't you think?
Right.
I'm sorry, you're telling me that what I'm doing is not the normal form, but then my form is wrong?
Yeah.
So anyway, I did enjoy that, and I'm kind of curious to see. I actually now want them to review my next release to see what they do with that.
Right. Yeah, no, that would be interesting. So I was curious too about, so with the recording of Summon and Breathe, I was interested as well in how you fell into and this is where the question may get a little strange, but at least, like, how did you fall into this sound of yours? Because this sound is something that I've never really come across before. Just a lot of the layers and the ethereal vocals, and then you have the electronic beats mixed in there, but you also have the violin, and it's just at least on Summon, it's very distinct, very unique, at least to my ears, and I'm interested in how this sound pours out, or how you stumbled upon this, or how it just organically manifests.
First off, that's very kind of you. Mm-hmm. I suppose because I don't know. I mean, for me, when I'm writing on things, I just, again, it's like back when I get back to the whole idea of tones and colors and someone's gait and how they move. Mm-hmm. It's all very connected. So I just hear sounds that work with the words that I'm thinking of, and I just look through the sounds until I find what I'm trying to get. Like all of the violin notes in that, I improvised. Like I didn't score it out beforehand. I just kept playing, and I would keep playing and then loop it again and take a channel and say, okay, this one's going to be my effects. Like, what do I want this to sound like? Where is it the point when I need people to listen? And so that was where that was. And for example, the first part of Summon, there's harp strings, and it's talking about being a bird, but to me, harp strings look like the wires of a bird cage.
Okay.
So for me, it's kind of like a visual and aural link nearly. But then for the layers, I don't see a huge amount of. I don't understand why there's barriers between the different forms of music and sound.
Sure.
Like I don't, and I think that's part of why it sounds like that, because to me, it's this sort of air that you swim in. Really, It's because every day we walk through just layers and layers of sound. I went deaf for 3 days, basically, when I was working underground in the library because of the dust and everything built up on my ears. But when I got them cleaned out, obviously, I could hear the city in layers. Like I could separate out each sound. It was incredible. And that's something you do when you train classically. You have to be able to isolate and separate out sounds and then put them back in.
Sure.
So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question properly.
Oh, no, you are. It's one of these tangents that it's me trying to put a finger on a pulse, or trying to just understand more of this sound, because I know a bit about electronic. I'm not very knowledgeable on classical arrangements or classical notes, for that matter. Like even when I talk about certain albums, I have a hard time distinguishing or describing, say, how stringed instruments sound. It's just kind of me floundering through, and I was just trying to get some semblance of how you crafted the sound, because just the the melding of them, I don't know, like I've just never heard anything like it. And I just find it very intriguing. And based on some of the stuff I've read on your background, it doesn't really seem like you've necessarily you haven't been very electronically inclined with respect to that genre of music per se, but that's just a dimension that pours out when you produce as VANCORVID. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's definitely correct. So part of the reason the sound I have developed the way it did was one Christmas my brother gave me 3 pedals, a loop station, an octave, and a Boss BD2 bass driver. So with that, I've been able to completely transform how it sounds. And the other thing, I suppose, the reason, my background, yes, you're totally right, to folk rock, I guess, to punk, to hip hop as well. So all of those are in there, just in their own sense. But I think a lot of the reason that what comes out as electronic is I don't need anybody else to be there.
Right.
I used to make the joke that, it's me and my machines. And so that's partly why, because I can just make the machines do everything I need. I learned how to write beats, and that was actually probably my favorite part, just because I was able to create multiple permutations of how I wanted the sound to be. I saw, like, Björk once talked about how making microbeats was like embroidery to her, and that really kind of stuck with me, the idea that you can just iterate over music electronically in a way that you often don't have the opportunity to in other genres of music.
And when you say microbeats, is that something are those more subtle and in the background, not so much in the forefront of a composition? I just want to make sure I get trying to learn as much as I can and also crystallize some of the vernacular here.
I suppose microbeats, some of it would be background, yes, but more along the lines of those beats that sound like maybe one beat, but it's actually made up of a combination of sound.
Okay.
Like the Björk sound, where there's drum beats that don't sound even like they're from this planet.
I see.
That would be often a combination of multiple flavors. Like the way, certain kinds of sauces are actually made up of like a ton of ingredients, but you just know it as like barbecue sauce.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So technically barbecue sauce would be a microbeat sauce.
That's very interesting. Yeah, see, okay. This is all, I'm learning so much. I'm going, yeah, I have a lot of, I just always flounder to describe certain sounds, and I sometimes feel like I use certain words, but at the same time I'm not sure if I'm using them in the correct way or in the correct context. But it's good to get some clarity around these. So I wanted to go a bit into, and this is another tangential thought or another tendril that I'm not necessarily too familiar with, but some of the fascination or your genuine intrigue with crows or corvids, as you mentioned, correct? That's the genus of them? Yep. Is that right? And I found that interesting, in addition to, say, the more Celtic, the goddess Morrigan. And I don't know much about this, but I just found some of the insights you left on some of the interviews. I wanted to just explore that a bit, because you've spoken a bit about asking Morrigan for guidance and such, and I believe summon has some relation to this as well, correct? Or is there some sort of part of you that, or there's some dimension of this that relates to that composition? Is that right?
That's correct. So I suppose, would you prefer for me to talk more about crows or the Morrigan first?
Well, yeah, we can go in both. This is me conflating the two. I wasn't sure if, say, Morrigan took on the form of, say, a crow in a certain sense, or if there's some relationship between the two. That's why I brought them up in the same thought. But this is also an opportunity for you to set me straight and tell me, or kind of distinguish between the two, so I clarify my words a bit better.
Totally. So basically, Morrigan is an old Irish goddess, and she can often, and does often, take the shape of a crow.
Okay.
She appeared during the Ulster mythological cycle, and basically the Battle of Moytura, there's some old scrolls where her work or her presence is recorded. But what's really interesting about her is that there's actually very little concrete information about her compared to the other gods in the pantheon. In fact, parts of the manuscript where she speaks have been deliberately destroyed. So basically, she is a battle goddess. She is also a goddess of sexuality and independence, but that's kind of a misnomer in that what she actually is more sovereignty and strength. So when she appeared in battle, she would be the one flying above the heroes, the warriors, and encouraging them to victory. And the idea was that if you rejected her, it would bring dire misfortune upon you. So one of the great Irish heroes, Cuchulainn, rejected her, and one of the lines she said to him is, "It is at the guarding of thy death that I am and I will be." And it's actually a line that got into the summon a little bit, which is, "I am the guardian at the hour of thy death." And again, that for me relates more to depression and friends of mine I've had who have been in that point, and sometimes I have felt like a guardian, as I'm sure they've felt for me as well.
Sure.
So that's part of it, and I feel like as well it's a part of honoring my heritage as well. I'm Irish, I'm very proudly Irish, and I know I'm based in Toronto, but I always try and make sure that people very much know that I'm from Ireland. But for me, it was a case of, she seemed like the kind of individual who was very difficult to pin down even in war. Like, it wasn't that she took sides, she just is. And essentially, that was something to me that I particularly liked, and it resonated with me, because I don't necessarily think that there is always, I think it's very easy to get pulled into sides in some regards that you don't want to be.
Sure.
And I'm not referring that to the current political climate, by the way. I don't think that's the same kettle of fish, but
sure.
So that's part of it. And I feel like there is a degree of trying to emulate something that is so much bigger than you, even though at the moment sometimes it's very hard to maintain any kind of faith in anything higher, particularly with the news happening at the moment. But I feel like it's something to cleave to, and the color scheme and the music and everything, I wrote that with her in mind.
I see.
So, hopefully that answers some of that. And
yeah, sure.
And then with regard to crows, in and of themselves, I mean, obviously they're related to Morrigan, and what's fun is that I make a joke that I'm the only crow in Toronto, because they all died there of West Nile disease, but crows tell each other things down generations, so they will inform families, don't go to this area, it's poisoned. So there haven't been any crows in Toronto, so that's my joke. I'm the only crow there. I'm calling them back.
That is the case too. Like, they actually communicate those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So be nice to every crow you ever meet. They will remember your face and they'll tell your families.
I've heard I've seen there was that one study where somebody went out and they wore a certain mask, and they screwed with some crows, or they kind of gave them grief, but then when they would put on another face, they wouldn't necessarily recognize that individual, but when they put the mask on where they were berating the crows, they would get up on them, or they would give them crap. So I know that much, but I didn't know that there was the communication through the generations, which I find very interesting too. I did not know about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so not only that, they are essentially, in terms of cranial structure and intelligence level, they are basically just behind apes and humans.
Oh, okay.
They're super smart anyway, and
yes.
What I like about them as well is that they're all over the world. So most places, no matter where I go, I'll end up seeing crows. They also, they're they're messengers, they're tricksters. There seems to be one in every culture, and one thing, they don't all conform to one thing. Like, some are family oriented, some are single, some are, some can be aggressive, some not, and it's just, there's a crow, it seems, in every culture. Like, it can be anyone. And my family have this we have this kind of little joke running, that because I moved away, obviously, we miss each other. Right. But the dog, who you might be able to hear downstairs,
I can hear a little bit, yes.
Yes, she is shouting the dog equivalent of "Get off my lawn." But anyway, apologies for that.
Oh no, it's okay.
But she runs out, chases birds, of course. But the crows here play with her. They fly up just out of range, and then just into her range a little bit and fly back. So she goes mad, and
they get some enjoyment out of it, you think, or they kind of they enjoy just playing around and having fun. That's kind of a form of entertainment for them, you think?
They just play. Yeah, they just play. They don't care. And so my mom says that that's me coming back to play with the dog. But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, crows to me just made a lot of sense. They're strong. They're smart. They they move directly, you know.
Right.
And a small joke about that was as well, if someone thought that my singing wasn't very good, I was like, well, I named myself after a crow, not a nightingale.
No,
So
that's really good. I was also curious too, just on more of the, and I don't know how interesting this is to go down this path if you enjoy articulating or talking about this, but I was also curious about how long you've been, I don't know what the right, how long you've been intrigued with Morrigan, because I do recall there was even a bit where you said in one of your interviews trying to pay respect and pray to this god or goddess. And I just found that interesting, like how you've integrated that into aspects of your life and how long you've been doing that for.
as in intrigued by the Morrigan?
Well, I just find that fascinating. The paying, I don't know what the right word is, like paying respects to or trying to speak to this goddess of a sort. If that makes sense. Maybe it's a dud of a question on my part.
No, it's more I'm just trying to think of how to answer it, how long I've been intrigued by that. I suppose I think it came out with the idea of just, I'm trying to think when it really began, because I've always been interested in mythology and reading fairy tales since, I collect fairy tales all over the world. But I think actually once I started getting into the Morrigan, I was quite young, reading about her and reading the myths, and there's a lot of really good artists here who make these incredible paintings of her, and I just remember just being fascinated. And it was much later that I thought that I could make something to pay respect to that.
Sure.
And I think, whether or not you choose to pay homage to a specific entity or deity within yourself, it's sometimes, in a lot of these old rituals and these old stories, it's you making yourself in the image you perceive it to be, without that being blasphemous. But it's basically emulating something that you see as higher than yourself to get where you need to be.
Okay.
I hope that.
No, yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, it's just one of these. I just find it interesting. I was intrigued by it just because I've never really. I've read some mythology, and I've had a little bit of exposure to it, but just you being so upfront about it in some of the interviews and saying, I've done, or you've asked the goddess for guidance, or you've paid homage in a sense. I just find that very fascinating, just as sort of, be it a belief or what have you, or just I don't know, I just haven't really stumbled across that before in any individuals I've spoken with, and I was just trying to get a little closer, try to figure out more about it, if that makes sense.
No, I get you, and I suppose it is not the most usual faith to have, to essentially decide upon an entity to provide devotion for. But for me, it was, I knew that whatever I intend to do going forward, and what I've done so far, is going to require strength and independence.
Right.
And that's what she epitomizes. It's what she embodies. So
right.
Yeah. So reading into it more than others, just very brief tangent on that. There's two main Irish. Well, there's a couple of Irish goddesses that tend to spring to mind. One is Bridget, who became Saint Bridget, but she's very much the nurturing, motherly Earth Mother goddess type, more so, whereas Morrigan is much more blood than milk. So she's not one to kind of, there, pat you on the head kind of thing. It's, get up and do the thing you need to do.
Right.
And for what I'm trying to do, that's what I need.
Okay. Yeah, and that makes sense, because I can see how that relates quite clearly with the lyrics, or some of the spoken word, at least in the beginning of Summon. I believe the way you articulate a bird beating up against a ceiling or a glass ceiling of a sort and trying to summon up or break out of this or evolve into something bigger than yourself, if that's a correct way to articulate it. You can correct me on that too.
You're right on the money. And fun fact, the battering bird idea, that actually was based on the time I caught a sparrow.
Right, I think I read a bit about that. What was that happened in some sort of a cafe or a restaurant you were working at, is that right?
Yeah, I was in Boston and I was working in a juice bar, and a sparrow flew in and started whacking itself against the wall, the glass walls or windows, and yeah, I just had to grab someone's hoodie and fling it over it so that it stopped, and just threw it outside. And within a second, I couldn't tell which one had been the one inside.
Right.
But, yeah, no, it's kind of, because a while ago, again, I read something else that said, like, whenever you're in a really bad funk, or you're frustrated or something, it's because you've reached a ceiling somewhere and you need to push past that to get to where you need to be.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of, the two kind of came together, and it was just a sense of, like, a lot of the time when something is happening and I'm upset, the main thing that's upsetting me is not the thing happening, but the why.
Sure.
And so if people don't get answers to enough things that are happening to them, that's when they start to feel pressure, and that brings it to the boil, and that's when the bad things happen. People lash out, or they lash inwards, and that's my fear. That's what I want to help people stop doing.
Sure, that makes sense. And this may sound ridiculous too, this question, but when you had that experience and you caught that sparrow, or you please correct me if you saw yourself in this sparrow, in a sense, trying to break out of this glass ceiling or break beyond, like, how did you know, or is there a way you knew that composing a song about it or writing something about it, how did you know that would be a way to break out beyond this ceiling, as opposed to doing it via some other means? And whatever those other means are, I don't know. I just am curious how composing helped you break out beyond this, or beyond that feeling.
It's pretty simple, actually. It's because music is truth.
Okay.
So, because whenever I find with thoughts aren't always true. When I play violin, my muscles are true. They don't lie.
Okay.
And the muscles, so basically I write when I walk. So I have to be walking for a long time for the words to come out. So that's the truth of what I feel at that point. So for me, the way to get to the why is to find that truth. And the way I find the truth is through movement, through music.
I see.
So that's how it is, because for me, nothing else is very certain, really.
Right.
Because of the constant flood of information.
Yes.
So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay. No. That's perfect. I don't know. Sometimes I get myself caught up in these thoughts, and I think that there's some grandiose reason for things, but just the simplest answer seems, that explains it perfectly. I was also interested in just this may stray the path a bit from the music, but the one note you left about collecting fairy tales, I found that fascinating just as a hobby, and I was curious if that maybe does relate in some respects to the music you produce, but I was just interested in that hobby of yours because I just decided to look up fairy tales and things of the sort on the web, because sometimes I get a little fuzzy with respect to, say, fairy tale versus mythology and things of the sort, so I wanted to clarify it. And when I went on Wikipedia, trust the sources much, take it with a grain of salt, I was blown away at how many Irish ones there were, just the vast list of them compared to all other countries, cultures, what have you. It was pretty remarkable to see how many originated or stem from that area, that location. But I was curious about that hobby of yours, or that interest.
Well, it's something I find. So two things about fairy tales. One, I think the reason that Irish fairy tales are so prolific is because Ireland has a very long tradition of storytellers and harpers, but we also have a very long history of immigration. So it's very easy for our stories to get disseminated versus other cultures. I don't necessarily believe that we have more stories than other cultures. We just have written more of them down.
Okay.
And I think, because if you are curious, actually, there's an author, Angela Carter. She put together a wonderful book of fairy tales from around the world. But the reason I love fairy tales is they tell you more about a culture often than the history. And there's a reason, because one, the fairy tales are often dictated by the land. So, for example, if you look at Japan, most of the land is mountains and there's a lot of sea. So there's a lot to do with wells and, for the horror stories, for the death rituals, things like that. The idea of mountains and wisdom, the sea being the unknown. And then as well, you get to realize that a fairy tale isn't easy to remember off the top of your head. You have to learn it, you have to learn how to tell it, and then you have to be able to transmit it so that it passes down generations. So
Right.
if something made it into a fairy tale, it was important enough to enough people to get passed down that far.
Right.
And so for me, it's very important to know that if you think about something like Cinderella,
Mhm.
the idea that anyone could be suddenly elevated from a terrible life to something completely out of the ordinary.
Hmm.
And it may have happened once or twice in the past, but it was big enough for those people for it to transmit down the line. And it's in multiple cultures as well. Like, where is it? I think I'm trying to remember. It was somewhere in South Asia. There was a different version of Cinderella, but
Okay.
I'm trying to remember the exact country, but it's slipping my mind. But at the very end of it, Cinderella actually sends back her cruel stepsister in a jar of food to her stepmother, who
Oh.
as a gift. And the mother eats most of it before she realizes what it is.
Oh man. Okay.
Yeah, so
That's
it's
pretty grim.
oh, some of them get super grim.
Yes.
But yeah, no, and so there's a lot to do with that as well. And then fairy tales were actually part of my thesis, where I looked at Scottish local fairy folklore and how it transformed into European diabolism within the space of a few years, just because of the witch trials and everything like that.
Right.
And it's very interesting to see how something that can enforce a cultural memory or a community memory can be changed in that way as well. So I think fairy tales are incredibly important to remember where everything came from, why things are the way they are, because fairy tales and the Bible and a few other elements, at least in Western Europe, can set a lot of legal precedent. So you can actually see where, if you understand the stories behind them, then you can actually see a lot of the reasons for why people behave the way they do today.
Oh, that's very interesting. I've just never trekked across many different fairy tales before. And is there any way you see those or is there any way that those play into VANCORVID, or do they have any influence? I do recall, or you noted about some, and you had speaking in Irish in there, but I wasn't sure if that had some relation paying respects to your homeland, but if there was any influence from, say, the fairy tales you collect, maybe, say, from Ireland itself. I was curious if that had any influence in your compositional process.
Direct fairy tale or mythological cycle into it, not exactly. I mean, the closest would be the Ulster cycle, which was the also known as the Cloyne. It was one of the greatest cattle raids in Irish mythology. I would say history, but it's not documented, so it's a little dicey on that one.
I see.
Basically, a very, very Cliff Notes version of the story. The High King and Queen of Ireland were having pillow talk one night, and for some reason it got to, I have more X than you. So they ended up deciding the next day to count everything that they both owned down to everything they were equal, except in one where the husband, King Ailill, had a magnificent white bull, and Maeve did not, Queen Maeve. And so she went out to try and find a bull that was its equal, and she did find one who was managed by this shepherd, and she sent out envoys to ask for it. Originally, the shepherd said yes, and then he overheard the men joking about how they would have taken it anyway, so he said no. And then it became this giant cattle raid of Cooley, which is a place in Ireland, and all the gods got involved as well. Similar to the way the Trojan War began over a dispute over a woman. So
Sure. Okay.
always a dispute over something. But yeah, for me, it was, I suppose, that element of knowing how much strength someone can provide. I suppose it's a case of I could see what she could do there, and I could also see what she could take away.
Okay. As more of a kind of a closer, and we already went into this a little bit, but say for 2019, in addition to the Hatch EP, is there anything related to VANCORVID or other projects that are on the horizon that you're working on that people can say look forward to, or maybe give some small insight into what you will be doing for the duration of next year? I can't even believe we're already at the end of 2018.
Yeah, so basically the ideas I had for Hatch are there, but there's been a couple of other things that have kind of popped up in the meantime that I want to release anyway, as shorter elements. And the other thing is that now that I've made incredible connections this year, like people I absolutely treasure. One of whom was Martin Bose from Attrition, who's engineering. I'm going to the Cage in a week, no, 3 days. Oh my gosh. To record on his next album and hopefully some of my own work too. And the other person was Precious Child, who is based in LA. They're amazing. If you haven't listened to any of their work,
I've only listened to the remix that they did of your track Summon. I thought that was a really great remix. I listened to both of them side by side, and they're both just superb in their own respects.
Yeah, Precious was the one who actually just took all of this and shot, like, made it an absolute supernova. Because I played a show opening for them, and I was starstruck. And afterwards, they were like, "Yeah, that track Summon you had, I'd like to remix it." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." Yes, please.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Is kind of one of those, I don't even know what to do with this right now.
Right.
Except, just pardon me for a moment, I'm just going to go scream into a pillow. But yeah, so that really helped, and I really hope I can work with them more next year. I've been trying to maybe nail them down to some plans. I was just in Montana. I want to go back, just because it was so beautiful, and I wanted to maybe make some work there as well, just because I feel like it would be a really good place to get something done in that respect. But
right.
Overall, it's mainly just shows. I have 2 in Montreal in January and 1 booked for Toronto already in March.
And these are all for your VANCORVID project, or they're not? They're specifically focused on that?
Specifically for VANCORVID, one, like, I'm opening for other people, but for me, that's still my work, so I'm happy about that. And then trying to work more with the promotion marketing side, so people actually know what I do. It's always a struggle trying to balance having the work people can listen to versus performing it so that people know who you are.
Sure.
Yeah, so I just I need to clone myself, and then I'll be gravy.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.